By the mid-19th century, China accounted for 1/3 of the world's GDP, commanding the most self-sufficient economy on the planet. The world was addicted to Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, luxuries so refined that British aristocrats were willing to trade away entire vaults of silver just to have them. Silver poured into China like a flood. Europeans called the empire the black hole of global wealth, where treasure entered but never escaped. But only a few decades later, that river of silver reversed. China, once the world's workshop of luxury, became a financial corpse. Its reserves drained dry, not by war, but by opium. A reversal of the world order had begun, not through gunfire, but through trade and addiction. And behind that addiction stood the British Empire, newly industrialized, hungry for capital, hungry for markets, and even hungrier for power. They realized that if they couldn't persuade China to open its ports through diplomacy, they would force them open with opium. At that time, China's currency was backed by silver, not gold. Every ingot of silver in circulation represented the strength of the nation's monetary system. The more silver there was, the more stable prices remained. When silver grew scarce, money gained value and goods became cheaper, an ancient form of deflation. Across the world, Britain faced the opposite reality. The British drank hundreds of millions of cups of tea every year, ate from Chinese porcelain, wore Suzhou silk, yet the only thing they could offer in return was silver. China, proud and self-sufficient, didn't need British steel, textiles, or machines. So Britain had to pay in hard silver, money with intrinsic value, for every shipment of Chinese goods. Within just a few decades, so much silver had flowed eastward that the reserves of the Bank of England were nearly exhausted. For an industrializing empire, this wasn't just a commercial loss. It was the world's first true global monetary crisis. Britain needed something the Chinese would crave at any cost, something to flip the trade balance. And then they found it. Opium, a soft financial weapon cultivated on the occupied fields of India. Global trade in the 1800s was like a network of arteries, and China sat at its heart, pumping silver in one direction and wealth in the other. But in London, the bankers could feel the pulse fading. Britain's treasury was running dry. Silver, the foundation of global credit, was flowing out faster than it came in. To the British elite, China was not just a trading partner, it was a bleeding wound. And so, among the merchants and financiers of London, a dangerous idea began to grow. If we can't sell them what they need, we'll make them crave what we sell. That idea became a weapon. The weapon was opium. In the vast fields of British-occupied India, fertile rice paddies were replaced with poppy flowers. Indian farmers were forced into contracts that allowed them to grow only for the British East India Company, a corporation so powerful that it ruled over millions and minted its own currency. Under the burning sun, laborers harvested sap from the poppies, the raw ingredient of addiction, neatly pressed into blocks and shipped by the ton. By the time the cargo left Calcutta's docks, it was no longer agriculture. It was financial warfare, wrapped in wooden crates. At first, opium entered China quietly through smugglers and bribes, but soon the trade became a flood. Officials were bought off, merchants turned greedy, and the habit spread like a fever. Smokehouses appeared in every port, every alley, every home. A nation that once exported refinement had begun importing ruin. Each puff of opium meant another ounce of silver leaving the country. Each night of oblivion was another step toward economic collapse. By 1820, China had spent over 7 million silver dollars on opium, a staggering amount for an empire whose money was made of silver itself. By the 1830s, the drain became catastrophic. Customs officers reported that silver is flowing out like water to the sea. And when silver, the very blood of the monetary system, drains away, the body dies. Prices fell. Farmers couldn't sell their crops. Merchants lost liquidity. Tax revenues dried up. It was deflation, slow, invisible, and deadly. The Qing Empire was suffocating, not from war, but from economics. Britain had found a way to destroy its rival without ever firing a shot. But one man refused to watch his nation decay. His name was Lin Zexu, a governor known for honesty, intelligence, and a fierce sense of duty. He saw the truth others ignored. If China did not stop the outflow of silver, it would die from within. In 1839, Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, a question so piercing that it echoed through history. "If opium is forbidden in your country, why do you sell it to mine?" The Queen never replied, but China would give its own answer. That same year, Lin Zexu ordered the confiscation and destruction of over 20,000 chests of opium in Canton, more than 1,000 tons of the drug poured into the sea. The smoke of burning opium rose over the coast like a funeral pyre for an empire's pride. To the British, it was not law enforcement. It was an insult to the flag. And for a global power addicted to profit, humiliation demanded revenge. The cannons were already being loaded. The Opium War had just begun. When Lin Zexu burned the opium in 1839, he didn't just destroy a drug, he destroyed a business model that powered the British Empire. To London, it was not about morality. It was about money and pride. And when you attack an empire's income, it will always respond with war. By 1840, a British fleet was already sailing toward the Chinese coast, a floating wall of gunboats, steam engines, and iron cannons. China's Qing Navy, made of wooden junks and outdated muskets, didn't stand a chance. The first battles were brutal and swift. At Dinghai and along the Pearl River, the British used steam-powered ships that could sail against the wind and the tide. For the first time in history, naval combat was no longer ruled by nature. It was ruled by technology. China had the numbers. Britain had precision. Every cannonball that struck a wooden ship was a reminder that the industrial age had already left Asia behind. By early 1841, the British had captured city after city, including Canton, the very heart of China's foreign trade. They demanded reparations for the destroyed opium, safe trade routes, and open ports for British goods. The Qing court refused. They couldn't imagine losing to foreigners they still called barbarians. But reality was merciless. In 1842, British troops advanced up the Yangtze River, cutting off supply lines and threatening to march straight to Nanjing. Facing economic collapse and military humiliation, the Qing Empire finally surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking was signed that same year, a document historians would later call the beginning of China's century of humiliation. Under the treaty, China was forced to pay 21 million silver dollars in war reparations, open 5 major ports to British merchants, grant Britain most favored nation trading status, and cede Hong Kong as a permanent British colony. It was not just a defeat, it was the sale of sovereignty. In London, the victory was celebrated as a triumph of free trade. In China, it was a funeral for a 2,000-year-old worldview. The empire that once dictated terms to the world now had foreign flags flying in its ports, foreign merchants setting prices in its markets, and foreign silver flooding its economy. Again. But this time, it didn't bring stability. It brought dependence. The opium trade exploded after the war. Addiction spread even deeper, corruption multiplied, and the Qing dynasty, once the richest on earth, was now a debtor in its own house. China's collapse was not just a military defeat. It was a financial disintegration. When your economy depends on silver and your enemy controls its flow, every cannon shot is an invoice, every treaty is a loan, and every addiction is a tax you never agreed to pay. The First Opium War had ended, but the price of that victory would echo for another century. Peace didn't last long. Barely a decade after the Treaty of Nanking, China was again in turmoil. Rebellions burned across the countryside, and opium addiction had become a national sickness. Sensing weakness, Britain saw another opportunity, not just to trade, but to dominate. In 1856, a small incident lit the fuse. Chinese officials boarded a British ship called the Arrow, arrested its Chinese crew, and allegedly lowered the Union Jack. To Britain, this was not just an insult. It was a perfect excuse. Gunboats were dispatched once again. But this time, the British didn't come alone. France joined under the pretext of avenging a murdered missionary. Together, the Western powers launched the Second Opium War. The battles were devastating. Chinese soldiers, still armed with bows and flintlocks, faced cannons and rifles that could tear through walls. In 1858, the Anglo-French forces captured Canton and pushed north toward Beijing. The emperor, terrified of another invasion, agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Tianjin, a document so humiliating that even the ink bled shame. It opened 11 more ports, allowed foreigners to travel freely inside China, granted missionaries the right to preach, and, most cruelly, legalized the opium trade. But before the treaty could even be ratified, the Qing government tried to resist one last time. They fortified the Dagu forts at the mouth of the Hai River, determined to block the Western fleet. It was hopeless. In 1860, British and French armies broke through the defenses, marched directly to Beijing, and looted everything in their path. When the invaders reached the Summer Palace, the Grand Garden of Emperors, filled with centuries of art and treasures, they burned it to the ground. Smoke rose over Beijing for days, turning beauty into ashes. Lord Elgin, the British commander, called it a lesson in civilization. With no other choice, Prince Gong signed the Convention of Peking. China paid 10 million silver dollars in reparations, granted even more trading rights, and officially surrendered its financial sovereignty. The British called it the triumph of free trade. But for China, it was the death of independence. By the 1860s, foreign powers had carved their own spheres of influence. Opium flowed legally in every port. Foreign troops guarded embassies inside the capital. A 2,000-year-old empire was now being managed like a corporation, one run by foreigners, financed by addiction, and paid for in silver. This was no longer war. It was occupation by finance. By the end of the 19th century, the Middle Kingdom was no longer the center of the world. Once an empire of craftsmen and scholars, China had become a market managed by foreigners. Its ports were open, its currency drained, its pride sold for silver. What began as a trade dispute had evolved into something far more profound, a lesson in how finance can conquer faster than armies. Britain never wanted China's land. It wanted its cash flow. Every chest of opium sold meant silver leaving China, flowing back into London's banks to finance factories, railways, and empire. Addiction became taxation, and every addict was another debtor paying tribute to globalization's first superpower. This was not just colonialism, it was financial colonization. For China, the cost was staggering. A century of humiliation followed, unequal treaties, internal collapse, foreign concessions carved out like wounds across its coast. An empire that had once been the world's largest creditor became the world's most indebted state. But out of humiliation came obsession, an obsession with never again losing control of its money. From that trauma grew a philosophy that still shapes modern China: economic sovereignty above all. The Opium Wars reshaped the world far beyond Asia. They taught every rising power that markets can be opened by gunboats, that currency can be stronger than cannons, and that the line between business and war is thinner than smoke. They also marked the moment the West realized its new religion: trade as conquest. From London to New York, financial empires were born, built not on territory but on debt, contracts, and demand. Today, silver no longer anchors currencies, and opium has taken new forms: data, oil, attention, credit. But the mechanism is the same. Control what others crave, and you control their economy. That was the true legacy of the Opium Wars, a reminder that the world's strongest empires are not those that conquer land, but those that conquer desire.